All right, ready to dive in. We're tackling Brene Brown's Dare to Lead today.
Yeah, and we're going deep using both the book and her insights from the workbook.
If you want to actually be a more courageous leader, this one's for you.
Actionable stuff, moving past the theory and into what you can do now.
I'm so ready. One thing that hit me hard was how Brene lays out those roadblocks to courageous leadership, like avoiding tough conversations or that fear of taking risks.
It's all about naming those obstacles, right? What we try to avoid often becomes the thing that holds us back the most.
Oh, for sure. I
Yeah.
know I do, that what stands in the way becomes the way, she says.
Exactly.
So true. And for me, fear of messing up, hands down, it's just easier to play it safe.
Right, but Brené's whole thing is that the vulnerability is the key to unlocking courage. And I know vulnerability can be kind of a loaded word.
Totally. Like, how do we embrace that, especially at work? Feels risky.
It does have some baggage. But Brené takes on those myths we have about it head on, like vulnerability equals weakness. She says it's the opposite.
Okay, I can kind of see that. You can't have innovation without risk, right? And you can't have trust without being real.
Exactly. Even when it's uncomfortable.
So how do we do that? Actually embrace vulnerability.
One exercise that helped me, it's called assembling your armor. Have you done that one?
I have. It's surprisingly insightful.
It's all about noticing how we armor up, right? Through our body language, the words we use, even the stories we tell ourselves.
Yes. Like, what are your self-protection mechanisms? The subtle ways we shield ourselves when we feel exposed.
Exactly, because that armor might feel safe in the moment, but
Yeah.
it also blocks us from real connection.
Which is what leadership needs, right? I know I can put up a wall of professionalism, especially when things are high stakes, but then I'm less approachable.
Right, and that's key to what Brené's saying. It's not about being perfect, it's about being real, which is terrifying, which is why it takes courage.
Okay, so we get that vulnerability matters, but how do we build that courage muscle? Is that learnable?
It totally is. One of the most useful tools she gives us is that BRAVING acronym. Remember, the 7 elements of trust. I think you can name them all.
7 elements. Okay, give me a sec. Okay, boundaries are huge. That's one. What else? Oh, reliability for sure, and accountability. Gotta have that. 3 down. How am I doing?
You're on a roll. 3 of the big ones. What about keeping confidences?
Oh, right. Vault, like we talked about with gossip.
Yeah.
Okay, so boundaries, reliability, accountability, vault. Man, this is making me realize I have work to do. What are the last 3?
Last 3 are all about showing up with integrity. So, acting in line with your values, being willing to give people the benefit of the doubt, that's non-judgment, and then being generous in how you see others.
Generosity. That's a powerful one.
It is, and I love that braving isn't just words, it's a framework for action. Brené wants us to think about how we operationalize these things on our teams.
That's key, because saying we value trust is way easier than actually doing it consistently. So how do we make that happen?
Well, there's an exercise in the workbook called, guess what? Operationalizing braving.
Operationalizing braving. Okay, that sounds kind of intense. Tell me more.
It's about getting seriously specific. Brené wants you to take each part of braving and figure out what does it look like in execution on your team.
Okay, I like that. So not just saying it, but living it.
Right. How do you show reliability? What happens when someone breaks a confidence? Those conversations aren't always easy, but they build trust.
And trust takes work, for sure. Speaking of work, Brene talks about creating a culture where feedback is safe, both giving and receiving it.
Huge. And she even gives you a tool in the workbook, the Engaged Feedback Checklist. It's got those good reminders, like making your feedback about behavior, not personality.
Oh, that's good. I've definitely gotten defensive about feedback before.
We all have. But the more we can practice receiving it with an open mind, the more we grow. And that's courageous leadership, making space for feedback as a gift, not an attack.
Totally changes the mindset, right?
Mhm.
From dreading it to seeing it as a way to grow.
Exactly. Speaking of growth, Brené talks about learning to rise from setbacks. Remember that SFD thing? Story we make up about our disappointment, failure, or setback.
How could I forget? I'm the queen of SFD sometimes.
Well, you're not alone. We all have those stories.
Like that time I bombed a presentation, I was convinced my career was over pure SFD.
Happens to the best of us. But the key is recognizing those stories and then challenging them. Because often those SFDs, they come from shame.
Shame. You mean feeling like you're fundamentally flawed? That's a fun one.
Not fun at all. And Brené's point is, shame kills courageous leadership. When we're in that spiral, we hide, we blame, we don't take risks.
We're right back to that armor, right?
It all connected.
It is. But here's the thing about shame. It can't survive being spoken out loud. So naming those shame gremlins helps us tame them.
Exactly. And the workbook's got exercises for that. How does shame show up? At work, in our lives, perfectionism, gossip, comparing ourselves.
Wait, hold on. Perfectionism is shame. I always thought that was a good thing. High standards.
It can be, to a point.
Hmm.
But when it's constant striving for this impossible ideal, it's actually a way to avoid vulnerability. Because if you don't put yourself out there, no risk of failure, no judgment.
Hmm. Hmm.
Oh.
You just blew my mind. Never thought of it that way.
Okay.
So if perfectionism is shame, how do we let go of that need to be perfect and lead with more courage?
Brene talks about embracing the suck. It basically means accepting that things won't be perfect. We will mess up, and that's okay. It's part of learning.
Easier said than done, right?
Yeah.
But I get it. It's about giving ourselves permission to be human, flaws and all.
Yes. And creating that space for the people we lead, because when we show up authentically, imperfections and all, it lets them do the same. That's how you build a culture of courage.
Like that saying, progress over perfection suddenly gets real.
Right. And Brene reminds us, building that courage culture, it's ongoing. It's not a finish line, it's the whole journey.
Oh, speaking of journeys,
Mm.
in the learning to rise part, I loved her breakdown of how we react to setbacks. She calls it the reckoning, the rumble, and the revolution. Ever use that framework yourself?
Oh, totally. It's so helpful for when things go sideways. That reckoning part, it's just admitting, okay, this sucks, I'm disappointed, frustrated, but then you hit the rumble. That's where it gets good, leaning into the sucky feelings, getting curious about those SFDs we're telling ourselves.
Yep, time to wrestle those shame gremlins, but where's the revolution come in?
That's the growth part. You take what you learned from the reckoning and the rumble, and you move forward with it. More courage, more wisdom. It's like turning those setbacks into lessons.
So not just bouncing back, but bouncing back better.
You got it. And the workbook has this awesome exercise. You break down an actual failure you had using the reckoning, rumble, revolution. It helps process it all, figure out what you learned.
Super helpful, because it's
Yeah.
easy to get stuck in the blame game. But if you come at it curious, ready to learn, that's powerful.
It is. And you know what's even more powerful? Realizing we don't have to do it alone. Brene talks about your square squad. Those people you trust to be there, thick and thin, they can handle your vulnerability and help you up when you fall.
I love that square squad. It's like your own personal hype team, but they also give you that loving reality check when you need it.
Exactly. They'll tell you the truth, even when it's hard, but they'll also remind you what you're great at, keep you going.
Because let's be real, courageous leadership, it's not always pretty. It's showing up scared, having the tough talks, embracing the messiness of being human.
Leading with your head and your heart.
Yeah.
Vulnerability and strength.
So as we wrap up our Dare to Lead deep dive today, what's one thing you hope listeners take away?
That courage is a skill. Anybody can build it. You're not born with it, you practice it.
Right.
And the more you practice, the more courageous you get, not just as a leader, but as a person.
That is beautiful. And a perfect note to end on. So to everyone listening, remember, courage, it's contagious. When you're brave, vulnerable, authentic, it inspires everyone around you. Go out there and be that courageous leader you are.
The world needs it.
And that's a wrap on this episode of The Deep Dive. Thanks for joining us as we explored courageous leadership. Remember, even small acts of courage make a difference. Until next time, keep daring greatly.